Story 1. My ex-boyfriend's mother was a linguistics professor and knew over 10 languages. She was also one of the dumbest people I've ever met. Some examples. She believed that, in case of emergency, flight attendants catapult out of the plane. She was also convinced that donating blood causes some blood disease and you can die because of it. But my favorite one was when she said her son's orthopedic problems are not a result of a serious injury he had. His knee hurts because he eats too much ketchup. Story 2. As someone who did 2 trades and then decided life is better with education, my experience currently going to university is how clueless so many people are in university. I wouldn't say they're ignorant, but a lot of ignorance develops living in a student bubble your whole life. I rented a room to a guy who did his master's, and it would take him hours to cook dinner. I watched him one day, and he just couldn't grasp the concept of cooking things that take different amounts of time simultaneously. For example, he'd start cooking potatoes and wait until they were done before moving on to the next thing he was going to eat them with. Story 3. My first call at my first information technology job was in a medical laboratory. There was a doctor who had been in the job for years, and she called saying her computer would not power on. I walked her through some troubleshooting, and nothing worked. Is the computer plugged in? Okay, is the monitor on? Okay, when did the problem start? Type of questions were asked, and she answered them all. I went up to her office, and indeed the computer was plugged into a power strip, which was plugged into itself. The cleaning crew had deep cleaned her office and never plugged anything back in. The doctor plugged the power strip into itself, thinking that as long as it was plugged in, that's all she needed. Story 4. I had a boss who was an engineer. He put a couple $100s in change in a bank's pneumatic drive-through tube where it got stuck, and they had to use a jackhammer to get it out. He was upset that the bank was charging him for this because he didn't know it would happen. They had large signs saying not to put change in the tubes, including on the tubes themselves. Story 5. I went to 3 emergency rooms when I felt something was wrong with my arm. It felt like a bug bite on day 1 and by day 4 like a bungee cord from my elbow to my wrist. 3 doctors said it was a skin irritation or dermatitis. I kept telling them something was wrong. I have no medical degree. I work in property management. On day 5, I walked into another emergency room and said, I don't care if I have to pay out of pocket or sit here all night, but something is wrong with my arm. Finally, after many rude looks and comments, I was given an ultrasound of my arm, then rushed to an MRI, then told I was being admitted. A 3-inch blood clot in my upper arm, 2 in my chest area, and 1 had passed my lung already. Diagnosed with factor 2 gene mutation 22 days later, a blood clotting disorder. Story 6. I have a Doctor of Philosophy, and I work with a bunch of Doctor of Philosophy holders. Basically, a lot of them think that because they succeeded in one area, they are an expert in every other area of life. And they always have strong opinions about everything. I think it's also called a Doctor of Philosophy syndrome. Story 7. I was at a keg party at college and the gravity keg was set up. Someone complained that the beer was not flowing, so I checked that the keg was still almost full. It turned out someone had closed the air intake on top. I opened the intake and poured myself a beer. Problem solved. A few minutes later, someone else complained the beer was out. I told them the keg was full a few minutes ago and that it was a tap problem I had fixed. They told me they just came from the keg. I went back to the keg and found the intake was closed again. I opened it and poured the young lady who said it was empty a beer. As she was leaving, my sweet mate came in and went to the intake and closed it. Now my sweet mate is a straight A student who gets all A's mostly due to his photographic memory. Back to the keg. So I told him that he needs to leave the intake open to let air in to displace the beer coming out of the lower tap. He then proceeded to tell me that since the beer is carbonated, air is not needed to replace the liquid volume lost when the beer is dispensed. So I asked him 2 questions. If it is not needed, why is there the upper tap? And does he really think the amount of gas the carbonation gives off in a glass of beer is equal to the volume of the liquid beer? He thought for a few seconds and his only response was, I have a 4.0. What is your grade point average? Then he walked away. Story 8. My wife's stepfather was a chemist who currently has diabetes. One night, He went to the emergency room because his blood sugar was dangerously high. He claimed he was eating well. He normally doesn't. So there's no reason why his blood sugar was high. In his car was a 2-liter bottle of ginger ale mixed with grape juice. He said that the two canceled their sugars out, and we didn't know what we were talking about because he was a chemist and he knows how to combine things. Story 9. I worked in information technology for a hospital. I was speaking to a doctor who forgot his password. While he was spelling his name phonetically over the phone, he said, Z as in xylophone. Needless to say, my eyebrows raised. Story 10. I worked with a girl who graduated from Brown University. She would never stop talking about it, always mentioning Brown University. I went to a state school, and it was apparent that she looked down on anyone who didn't attend an Ivy League school. One day, she was doing that, and I couldn't stop myself. I said something like, "Oh, you went to Brown University? And yet, here we are, together in the same place, doing the same job." Story 11. My college roommate, the smartest person I've ever met, spent nearly an hour trying to shove a desk back into the corner of our room at an angle. She wouldn't listen to me because, in her words, she got this. After she finally gave up, I walked over, pulled the desk out completely, straightened it with the wall and pushed it back in. One movement, no struggle. Many times, I've realized that she might be the smart one, but I've got more common sense. Story 12. Peter Duesberg, a molecular biologist, works as a researcher at the University of California, Berkeley, and is well known for his work. He became an AIDS denialist, claiming there is no link between HIV and AIDS. He led countless people down this path, including many who were HIV positive. These individuals ended up infecting others and refusing antiretroviral therapies. This included an AIDS denialist activist named Christine Majori, who infected her infant through breastfeeding, thinking it was not a big deal because HIV does not cause AIDS. Story 13. I worked for a statistician who had a doctor of philosophy in statistics and was as dumb as a post. On the other hand, I worked with this really smart guy who happened to have a doctor of philosophy, and as he said, all that means is I did the work for a doctor of philosophy. Story 14. Not quite doctor of philosophy, but I was at a party in the United Kingdom full of medical students, and stereotypically, everyone was off their face drunk. Well, some guy fell over and broke his collarbone and was immediately rushed by a dozen of them, all fussing and asking him the same questions over and going through the checklist. Half an hour later, he was still on the couch in pain, and I went in to ask if anybody knew why the ambulance was taking so long. Nobody had an answer because nobody had called one. A party full of medical students hadn't called an ambulance or made any transport arrangements for a guy in severe pain with a broken clavicle. Idiots. Story 15. I used to work at a university, and many academics are incredibly educated in their chosen field, but have the common sense of your average dachshund. My favorite was probably an entire group of geology professors and doctoral candidates who got stuck for a few minutes in an entryway because they didn't think to check if the door required a pull rather than a push, even though they had just entered through that same door not an hour before. Story 16. I have a PhD and I am an idiot in most respects. All it takes to get a PhD is to be really good at or persistent in doing research in one narrow area of study. Edit. Several commenters pointed out that I oversimplified things. A PhD also requires hard work, luck, and some basic competence in a topic. But that doesn't prevent one from being completely clueless in other aspects of life. Story 17. This is basically what The Best and the Brightest by David Halberstam is about. It tells the story of how the Kennedy and Johnson administrations got the United States into the Vietnam War, and it particularly focuses on Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. He kept escalating the conflict at every turn, and if you questioned him, he could overwhelm you with data showing that the United States was winning the war and the Defense Department just needed more troops and more money to succeed. I'm oversimplifying a great book, but that's the gist of it. A great companion piece to the book is a documentary called The Fog of War by Errol Morris. It's a one-on-one interview with Robert McNamara filmed near the end of his life where he reflects on the lessons he's learned. After watching it, many people come away from the experience thinking that McNamara is an intelligent and wise man, even though there is a mountain of evidence showing that is not the case. Story 18. As someone who works in security at a hospital, I can say that a good 90% of the doctors there are intelligent but lack common sense, and sometimes I wonder how they function on a day-to-day basis. I also forgot to mention that I am almost 2 years into a relationship with a pediatric cardiologist, and it is as surprising at home as it is with the ones I work with, but I cannot say it is boring. Story 19. Not really an answer to this, but I feel like sharing. I have a bachelor's in creative writing. I went through the worst times of my life getting through college, dealing with depression and missing my friends and family I moved away from, and have nothing to show for it other than a shiny piece of paper saying, "I did it." My current career uses nothing I learned in college, and I'm trying to get back into writing as a hobby and hopefully find some worthwhile opportunity to actually utilize my education. For years, I've been pestered by friends and family. Anytime I misuse a word, don't use proper grammar, misspeak, or autocorrect messes up a text, they will be on my case immediately to say something snarky about, "That's not how a writer should talk," or "Wow, it's amazing you got a degree in English with how badly you speak." My go-to response is often something like, "My text messages aren't being published. Genius." It's a really sore spot for me and immediately gets my blood boiling. Story 20. MBAs are probably the most overhyped group of people on the planet. I'm like 99% certain that nepotism was getting too obvious, so they had to invent an incredibly expensive degree that friends of rich people could get so that they could also get great jobs and become rich. Most MBAs I know are actually so dumb it hurts. Story 21. My wife has 2 master's degrees and a doctor of philosophy, is internationally recognized in her field, and is an absent-minded doofus. My role in her life is to ensure that her car works, that she takes her medications, and that she eats things other than yogurt and eggs. She can be brilliant 1 minute, then walk into the side of a moving bus the next. I love her dearly, but she's a numpty. Story 22. Worked at a tech company, was made team lead. One of our team members was a doctor of philosophy in astrophysics. He would message me constantly for how to do things that we had well documented, like how to install certain programs or how to gain access to servers or code repositories. Literally, we would sit in video calls together, and I would just read the instructions out loud and watch him do them. I was utterly confused as to how he could manage by himself. Story 23. A longtime good friend, absolutely brilliant, can literally beat you at chess blindfolded. Studied engineering in college and is one of the smartest people I have ever met. But he is a big picture guy, sees how things develop, and has great long-term vision. Incredibly successful. But with little things, he couldn't pack a suitcase, wouldn't know how to book a flight, was making boxed macaroni and cheese and couldn't figure out why it was so watery. Yes, he didn't drain the water after the pasta was cooked. Story 24. Mother-in-law has a doctor of philosophy in something related to botany. She thought India was a continental island like Australia. To this day, I still have no idea how that happened. When this came up, she was in her mid-60s. Story 25. A doctor told me my 6-month-old couldn't have strep because she was an infant. I ended up taking her to the emergency room because she was getting worse and no urgent care centers were open, and it turned out she did have strep. Story 26. In a personal note, my wife was a doctoral candidate when we moved in together. Early on, we went to a party, and when we got home, I told her I felt inadequate because I was the least educated person in every room and felt kind of dumb listening to them all go on about things I had no idea about. She said to me, "They each know the most about some little thing they just got their doctorate about, some gene mutation or how some molecule interacts in some rarefied environment, but apart from that, they are all just regular people who cannot figure out how to match their socks or talk to a member of the opposite sex." She said, "You are one of the most curious people I know. Your library is bigger and more diverse than anyone else I know, and you have actually read them. You ask questions and talk to everybody and have actual things to talk to them about because you know about things they are interested in." Now she is a medical doctor and doctor of philosophy, and all our friends are doctors of one kind or another, and I am still the least educated person at the party, but now I can see people are just people. Yes, you can be super smart about one thing or another and still be a failure in the real world. It is way more important to be a good, kind person who does what you say you will do than the smartest kid in class. At least that's how we raised our kids anyway. Story 27. I know many people in the science field that conduct double-blind randomized controlled experiments in the lab and then go home and check their horoscopes. Story 28. I don't need to listen to you, I have credentials. If you aren't willing to consider novel information because of the messenger, sorry, you're an idiot. Story 29. If you work in information technology, you feel this. Every lawyer, doctor, celebrity, and chief executive officer I've ever worked with is computer illiterate. They can email, they can use Twitter, and that's it. They confuse the mouse. They openly call themselves Luddites. They accidentally unplug the power and claim the box broke. Mega millionaires, too. Smart in other regards, but computers are their kryptonite.